Hello, Pauline Marinan here, introducing you now to the second of the Generation series, hoping that you enjoyed the first on Siobhan McKenna, Irish actress and treasured intellect, member of the President's Council of State and an active anti-apartheid campaigner and human rights activist, as well as everything else. An independent woman, and as you'll see from this series, the theme is that all of the women who reached the pinnacle of their successes did so without help from anyone, independently, with their own grit and their own determination and their own skills. Today's world, you might say, well, what's so unusual about that? In the 1980s, there were not just glass ceilings, there were concrete ceilings. And to get through those ceilings required a lot of true grit and determination and strength. The women had to be strong. There was absolutely no other way it would have happened. And they had to learn how to take the knocks, how to remain confident, and knowing that they would live by their own reputations, they had to work to a very high professional standard, which they did. So now we move from the beautiful garden surroundings of the interview with Siobhan McKenna in episode 1 to the London Tara Hotel, where a wonderful manager called Owen Dillon put his faith in this project and allowed me to have the use of a suite to use as a studio for the 4 of the programmes that were shot on location in London, where 4 women who had made their life in London and their success in London were based. And so the next person that we have is Gloria Hunniford, who at that stage, it's in the details that I provided with the series. It would take pages and pages to write down what she was doing at that time in the 1980s, and still is. Very active broadcaster, journalist, and activist in her own way. A very highly acclaimed woman of many, many talents and many activities. And she arrived. I mean, you probably wonder why I'm sounding so surprised, but I do believe that there is such a difference. Okay, you'll say, Pauline, it was 35 years ago. Why wouldn't it be different? But these women were contacted by me. Out of the 8 women, I only met 3 of them beforehand. Siobhan McKenna, to try and persuade her, for her to be convinced that she could trust me to do the interview because she had never given any televised interviews. And Detta Hokohoin, who we will see later. I had met her by fluke. I was going to London because she declined to be involved. And Gemma Hussey, the Minister for Education in Ireland, with whom I had worked on a commission looking into the role of women in the media in 1980. And I and Professor Yvonne Scannell from Trinity University were the legal eagles on that particular commission. It had been commissioned by the RTE, the Ireland's main broadcaster, the RTE Authority, to do this review on the role of women in the media. And if you read that report, that covered women in media at all levels, broadcast and print, and you saw the pyramid symbol of lots of women employed at the bottom levels, but as the pyramid went up, very little female representation. So, and indeed it covered advertising at that time in 1980 and the way women were portrayed. The fact that some broadcasters didn't allow women to read serious matters on the news. I could go on, but I mustn't. So we're back now to Gloria Hunniford, who arrived, as I was saying a moment ago. There were no PR people. I had contacted them, told them what I was trying to do, the objective of the theme of the series. Were they available? Would they like to be involved? When they had consented, date was set, communications about that date and the time confirmed. And the women turned up. There were no PR people, no publicists, nobody ringing up to say, what are you going to ask her? They appeared, groomed to the hilt, ready, willing and able to sit down and to just chat. And Gloria Hunniford appeared on that morning into the Tara Hotel, London Tara, looking exquisite, beautifully groomed, no affectation, no hullabaloo, no fuss. Here she was, and magically told her story and her recollections of her growing up in Northern Ireland. Talked a bit about patriarchy, talked a little bit about that, but also spoke about the matrilineal line and how her mother had pushed the pram out to visit her mother when the babies were born, and how Gloria had found herself following that kind of routine and was aware of that, and lovely recollections of visiting her grandmother deep in the countryside. And she vividly describes some of those memories. So I leave you in the hands of Gloria Hunniford in looking back on her childhood growing up in Northern Ireland.
Gloria is such a happy sounding name. Did you have a very happy childhood?
I must admit I was never really forced to look back on my childhood too much until recent years. I think it's since coming to London and extra interviews and suddenly people start asking you questions about this Irish upbringing. I say this as a working mother. My childhood was ideal because my mother never worked. She was always there. It's the typical sort of storybook mother, if you like. She was always at the house. I came home from school to the smell of traditional food being cooked, whether it was her baking bread or a good pot of stew or soup or whatever. It was at a time, of course, when Irish women really didn't work too much. I mean, my father just did not want my mother to work. There was that Irish macho pride, no wife of mine is going to go out to earn a living. And so I do remember that she wanted to work on occasions. Little jobs would crop up and she'd say, you know, how about that? And he'd say, definitely not. And in a way, she just accepted her lot. I mean, again, such were relationships then. She just accepted that she was at home. She never went out unless it suited my father to stay in to look after us. I never remember having a babysitter, you know, when I was younger, ever. It was always my mother or father were there, or my older sister or family. But that was just the situation. So, yes, when I look back on childhood, it was as perfect as any childhood could be. And I know that times have changed and all of that, and I'm a working mother and I wouldn't have it any other way for myself, but I think that she was perfection if you want to look at the storybook mother.
Do you think that she felt that you should work?
Well, she certainly never voiced her opinion and said, I don't think you should. I think that she herself deep down would probably have liked a little bit more freedom, but as I said before, situations in Ireland then were totally different. I mean, things have progressed an awful lot. And times have changed so much. She certainly never voiced any sort of motherly objections and said, oh, you know, I don't think you should be doing so much work. But then in my case, mine built up slowly but surely. I was at home when the children were younger, albeit I always found something to do. I'm just one of those individuals. I couldn't just stay at home and be a housewife, you know, in quotes. That's not to say that I don't admire people who decide to be a homemaker. I think it's wonderful. But for me, I just could never be that. I mean, I remember when Karen, my eldest child, was young, I mean, I was selling Avon and Tupperware just to give me pin money and to give me something to think about. But that's just my makeup.
Yes. Did you support your mother in those little confrontations when she was asking your father if she could take up a job?
Not particularly at that stage. I never really entered into their conflict. And in actual fact, my mother is the original peacemaker anyway. There were never any conflicts between she and my father. She just accepted, in a way, his word. The one frustration I always had was, I used to say to myself, how can she do that? How can she just not voice her opinion or not fight her little corner? But that's my mum. And now, of course, I think it's tremendous. And I think that wisely she knew when not to say anything. I'd be the worst. I'd be straight in there. Confrontation, arguments, sulking, the whole works, maybe for days, but she just was of that nature that she would do anything to smooth over an argument, and I think that's terrific. Funny enough, my youngest son is more or less the same. I see that trend the whole time. He will do anything to avoid the confrontation. You know, he'll smooth things over, And in the long run, he probably gets his way totally anyway, but he just has a different way of dealing with it.
When you look at him now, showing signs of your mother, do you tell him that? Do you say you're the image of your grandmother?
It has cropped up in attitude, you know, when we've talked about attitudes and certain characteristics, and particularly during interviews when people maybe have asked certain questions, and he's read it maybe somewhere as well. But there's just that one little trait about him. It's a peacemaker. I've always noticed it in him.
Is he particularly close to his grandmother?
Well, you know, Irish families, I mean, we're all very close anyway. He's not particularly close to her, in that he didn't see more of her than the other children did or anything like that. But we make a point of seeing her regularly anyway, so he would have had the usual access, if you like, or companionship of his grandmother, but nothing to excess. I mean, she never lived with us or spent an extra amount of time. She has, now that we're living in England, she has been over quite a lot on holiday. And from that point of view, he has seen her in a more concentrated fashion. But when I was living in Ireland, I mean, we saw her regularly. There is this great drawback anyway to the mother in Ireland, isn't there? Which is very nice. I mean, even when I'm here, I always feel I want to fly back to see her regularly anyway. So I think that sort of continues.
Do you look upon her as a friend?
I think in recent years she's become more so. When I was growing up, my father, I probably, when I say had more to do with, I started to sing when I was 9, or tried to sing when I was 9. And it meant that I saw a lot of him, because in his spare time, he was a conjurer, you see. So we used to travel around with this Mid-Ulster variety group. And it meant that I could have been with my father exclusively, maybe 2 to 3 nights a week. So I saw more of him outside school and all of that, probably, than I did of my mother. I mean, yes, my mother was always around the house, but I was always doing X, Y, and Z. But with my dad, we were, as I say, doing this sort of entertaining 2 and 3 nights a week. It was big business then, and I was very, very close to him. And then in later years, when I got married, I think that's the point that you fully appreciate what your mother has done. I think once you get married and you start to have children of your own, you realise then sometimes the sacrifices and sometimes the very hard work. And then I appreciated my mother an awful lot more. And progressively over the years, we've just become closer and closer. And then my father died about 5 or 6 years ago. And so since then, it's been an even closer relationship again.
Why do you think that brought you closer?
Well, I mean, just simply that she's left on her own, so obviously the responsibility increases. I mean, if the responsibility is shared and, you know, your father is alive and living with her, well, you know, that's still a unit. But then suddenly, when your mother's left on her own, obviously the responsibility increases, I think.
Did you find when he died that she was very lost?
No, because she always had an awful lot of friends. Even though I say she only went out when it suited him to stay in, I'm simply talking about organisations like the Women's Institute or seeing a girlfriend or something like that. I mean, in semi-rural Ireland, that really was the only entertainment then anyway. I mean, women didn't go into bars. I mean, still to this day, they don't really go into the public bar all that much, do they? I mean, certainly the lounge bars there. But I mean, I can remember when women just did not go near pubs unless accompanied. And so she wouldn't have been looking for that kind of entertainment. And so therefore her sources would have been organisations and friends. But she always, I mean, coming from the country, from real sort of country attitude, she always had an open door, teapot on the stove, lots of people calling in. So our house was always full of people, and luckily enough she had lots of friends. So when he died, she was able to pick up on all those friendships, and it was a very good lesson on, you know, on retaining friends and having lots to do.
It's amazing that you should refer to the door being open in the countryside. That's one of my memories of the Northern Ireland, always having the door open.
Yes, and to this day, people always say to me, why do you make a full pot of tea? Because if I'm just making it for myself, it's full to the brim. And it's a subconscious thing. I think, well, just in case anybody drops in, there's always something in the pot. And that really does stem back to my mum, because, I mean, people were always coming and going. And she always made this full pot of tea because she was pretty sure that somebody would pop in for an extra cup. And it's funny how little things stay with you.
Yes. What are your earliest memories of childhood?
My earliest memories of childhood, that's always very difficult. I mean, I remember isolated situations, but which came first, I don't know. I mean, I remember, you know, having this silly doll's pram and sort of pushing this up and down the the path at the back of the house. Now, whether I remember that because I've seen photographs of it subsequently, I don't know. But I was very, very small then, you know, pushing this doll's pram. I remember isolated situations as well of, you know, getting a bicycle. It wasn't a new bicycle, but it was new to me. And we didn't have a great surplus of money. I mean, we weren't poor or destitute, but we weren't flush with money. So I suppose children always tend to think of material things that they got, because I remember wanting this bicycle so badly. And it was a second-hand bike, and coming home from school one day, my dad said, well, go and have a look in the top shed, as he called it, up in the garden, and I looked in the shed, and there was this bicycle. So I remember things like that. And I remember riding the bicycle to and from school, because obviously we either had to walk to school or we had to sort of ride the bicycles. I remember running away from school when I was small.
Really? Why did you run away from school?
I do remember this. My sister was 7 years older than me, and she drummed education into me. I mean, she wanted to be a teacher when she was very young. And so she practiced on me when I was like 3 and 4. And so she hammered the daylights out of me if I didn't know my ABCs or my tables. And really, by the time I went to school, I knew all my ABCs, and I could really do most of my tables, because she hammered me if I didn't really do it correctly. So I still see that blackboard to this day. So when it came time for me to go to school proper, I was just about 4. I went to school quite early. And apparently I went and sort of, you know, said, well, I've done it now, I just don't want to stay anymore. And I actually walked out of the school and walked on home, much to my mother's absolute disdain, you know. She said to my sister, well, you were supposed to look after her. And my sister saying, well, I didn't know she was going to run away out of the class. I did it again when I was about 8. I don't remember the circumstances, but I remember thinking that the teacher had been very unfair. And I remember, I was a very hot-headed individual at times. I remember packing my school bag and saying to her, well, I'm going home because that is unfair and I'm not going to be treated like that. And I just got up out of the class and took my bag and went home. And you know, that teacher was as nice as ninepence to me for the rest of the time that I had her.
What was the reaction at home when you arrived back?
Well, I mean, I think when I explained that particular incident, I actually don't remember, you know, what the confrontation was with the teacher, but I think my mother agreed with me that it really was, you know, either bad handling or whatever, but she said, you've got to go back to school.
Were they supportive in that way?
Well, it was funny. If I really analyse the supportiveness regarding education, I actually had to fight with them, to argue with them, to go to grammar school. Because they felt, my sister before me had become quite a good legal secretary, because she had gone to a technical college and become a secretary. And they were of the ilk then that if you didn't want to be a teacher or a doctor, why go on to grammar school and subsequently go to university if you don't want, you know, in other words, why soak up all this education if you don't want to be a doctor or a teacher? Now, I know that sounds awfully silly these days when we're pleading and bribing children, you know, to really do well, and you're hoping that they'll stay at school and hoping that they go to university. But really, that just seemed to be the attitude then. Well, your sister's done very well by becoming this sort of good secretary, so isn't that good enough for you?
Did they give you confidence in yourself, your parents?
Well, yes, they probably did. I mean, both directly and indirectly. But I think that the most of that came from this performance from the age of 9. I mean, if you're going out to sing, or to say attempt to sing or whatever, the fact that you have to stand up on the stage and get used to the sound of your own voice and get used to performing to whatever degree it is, it must give you a bit of confidence, mustn't it? Mm. I mean, there is that age where probably it's terribly precocious, or you do it. I mean, children of sort of 9, 10, 11, they just dash on in without any nerves. They just do it. But on reflection, I think that probably, you know, that did give the confidence, and also did get me used to performance, yes, of whatever caliber.
Were they critical of you?
No, not particularly. I never remember my father being critical. I mean, funny enough, it was in Dundalk. I remember this particular incident. There was a concert in Dundalk, and I felt that I really hadn't performed well. I think maybe I was tired. I was still only about 13 or something. Maybe I was tired, I don't know. But I developed this tremor in my voice that I couldn't control. And I do remember clearly getting through one song and not being able to go on again. I just couldn't sing anymore. I was so nervous. It was the first time I remember big nerves really hitting. And I came off, and I remember my father saying, you've got to go on again. You know, you really sort of got to do it. And I said, I can't. But he was terribly supportive then, and he could have, I suppose, criticised and said, well, I agree with you, you know, there was a shake in your voice or tremor in your voice, or that was terrible. But he was always very comforting and very encouraging. So, no, I never lived with criticism.
Were you afraid of him in any way?
Not afraid as such, because maybe the fact that I spent so much time with him, I would say my bit to him, whereas my mother wouldn't. And in actual fact, he used to talk to me quite a bit. But I certainly regarded him. He was head of the household, and really his word was law. He could not stand anybody cursing. Nobody cursed in his house. It didn't matter what age group you were, nobody cursed. And I remember one day saying a word that actually I didn't even know was a curse word, you know. I just sort of said it. And he said to me, sorry, what was that you said? And I said it again, innocently. And he said, out. Now, he actually put me out of the house for that. Now, when I say out of the house, it meant this was maybe sort of 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I had to wander around for an hour or so until I was allowed back in. He just wouldn't have it. So his word was law in that respect.
And were you to apologise in those circumstances?
Oh, of course. Oh, yes.
And you knew what was required of you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was no black and white. If he'd made rules like you don't swear in this house, you never swore in that house unless you really did want to get out of it permanently. It was as simple as that.
Did he slap?
No, he didn't, actually. I had a fair number of slaps. My mother, she would have, but he didn't. I never really remember him hitting me at all. He may have made a dash for it or a swipe, but I never remember him hitting me.
Did you have confrontations with him? And there was a principle at stake.
I would have argued with him, yes, I would.
And what was his reaction to that?
Well, I mean, I remember particularly at the table I would have argued with him, because if my mother wouldn't say it, I'd be saying, why didn't you say something? You know, so I would put forward my point of view. And in the end, my mother would probably say, look, drop it. Because in a way, you couldn't argue with my father. You know, he had that opinion. He was going to stick to it. And in a way, you never would have won.
Do you think that it sank in at any stage that this was a sign that things would change?
Sorry,
that women would start answering back? Do you think?
No, I mean, no, that was all very innocent, really. I mean, again, you're going back to a time when you just did things by instinct. I mean, you've got to remember that I'm only thinking back on this because in recent years I've been asked to analyse it, or you're sitting asking certain questions, so you tend to analyse it more than you ever would have.
But you weren't conscious of it at the time?
No, the only thing I was conscious of was that I had an opinion and I wanted to voice it. Whereas my mum was prepared to, I knew she had an opinion, but she wasn't prepared to tackle it openly like that.
Did your mother tell you stories about the good old days, about the countryside, or about her family?
Well, we experienced that anyway, because she did come from the country. I mean, she lived at the end of a very long country lane. But we spent a lot of time out there. Just as I go back to see her, she used to push the pram 5 miles into the country to see her mother. And her mother used to come and see us in town. She called it coming to town, Wednesdays and Saturdays. It was that kind of routine. So we did see a lot of her, and we used to go out and spend holidays in the country in the summer. And those really are some of the most wonderful memories. I mean, I still quote them on air. You know, occasionally people will bring up the subject of the lovely Irish bread, you know, soda farls, which I always have to spell out in England, and wheaten bread and all of that. But you see, that's a great memory for me, because we used to go into the hayfield. It was making hay. I can still see my grandmother coming across the hayfield with this huge wicker basket and the hot steaming tea and the soda farls just off the griddle and the butter oozing out of it and the jam sort of dripping off it, and it was lovely. So I remember, you know, all of that, great memories. And also in those days, I mean, obviously she didn't have any electricity, so it was the tilly lamps or the oil lamps. And I was just talking about this the other day. You know, shadows with the oil lamp as you went outside the farmhouse to the outside loo, which was, you know, a little bit away, obviously, from the house, as it tended to be. And being afraid to go out on your own and having to say, oh, Granny, you know, come with me. And it was the shadows of the lamp. And even going down the corridors to bed, it was the shadows that the lamp created.
Did you talk to your grandmother a lot?
Not specially. I don't ever remember having the sort of conversations that I think you're talking about. I mean, this great confessing. I mean, yes, I talked to her, of course, on a day-to-day basis, you know, either when I went to see her or when she came to see us. But I never remember sort of treating her as a confidant. And
did you laugh with her?
Oh, yes, she had a great sense of humour. She was a very large, jolly lady. I don't mean large in terms of weight. She was a very tall lady and very strong features, which my mother also has, very strong features, although she's not tall. But she always struck me as being a jolly lady. My mother has a most wonderful sense of humour. Wonderful. And you know, I've only, I mean, when I was younger, I think I'd only seen her cry maybe 3 times, and that was devastating to me, to see my mother cry, because she was always smiling. In recent years, of course, with my father's death and sickness and all of that, I've seen her cry more. But I remember being absolutely heartbroken as a child to see her cry.
What was she crying about?
I don't even remember the incidents. I mean, it could have been, when I say periphery deaths of the family, I mean family that wouldn't have been particularly close to me, but maybe closer to her. But the time that she has cried has tended to be in connection with death within the family, as opposed to anything else. I never remember seeing her cry through, like disappointment or, through being down in the dumps or depressed or any. I never remember those kind of tears.
Would she have hidden that from you, do you think?
Well, she must have done if I never really saw her cry. I just remember her as a jolly lady, think of her as a jolly lady. And even, this year, she's been very ill this year, and she had an operation. And in the midst of all of that, when I was sort of devastated about her being ill, you go to see her in hospital sort of the second day, and she's telling you a story about having put her drip bottle and the bottle of blood that she was having in this, they put it in this shopping bag just so that she could literally walk to the loo or go up the corridor. And, she's sort of laughing, saying, I met the vicar, and I said to her, well, I'm just going off to do my shopping here, vicar, So it's that kind of humour that comes through when she's carrying this bag of blood and the saline. So that comes through the whole time, which is great.
You referred to the fighting spirit which you had. Do you think that you inherited that from her?
I think probably within herself she's a much stronger person than I am. I mean, she has always been a very, very strong person internally, in that, as I mentioned before, she was able to bite her tongue and sit back and be the peacemaker. And I mean, don't get me wrong, she's not an insipid person. She has her own opinions, and she'll do what she wants to do in the long way, but she'll do it her way. She doesn't do it in an abrasive confrontation way that I might tackle it. I mean, I'm straight in. Aries I am by birth or star sign, and I'm straight in there, really, like the ram, meet it head on, with everything that involves. She just tackles it differently. And so she has got this great fighting spirit, and she goes on improving on that. I mean, she goes on surprising us all, how she copes with each thing that comes along. She's actually stronger than we had even anticipated,
Did you care about your parents' relationship?
I never thought about it, to be honest with you. I never thought about it in those terms. I just accepted. I think most children just accept that their parents' relationship is fine. There was never any wrangling or arguments or bitterness. So I didn't see that. So I suppose as a child I just assumed that everything was all right, and indeed it was.
Did your mother talk to you about, I suppose they would have used the word courtship in those days, about her meeting your father and how she had met him? Did she reminisce
yes.
about
I
that?
mean, yes, they would have talked about, where they used to go for their days out, and, where they'd gone for their honeymoon and things like that. But she never really talked about great personal details of relationship. I mean, you've got to remember then that in those days, I mean, my mother wouldn't even have talked to me about womanhood and all of that. She would have been embarrassed to talk about that. The only thing she ever said to me, do they teach you about things at school? I said, what do you mean, Mum, things? She said, well, just about growing up and becoming a woman and things. I said, oh yes, oh yes. So there was as much embarrassment on my part then, because, I mean, people didn't talk about sexual relationships openly anyway. They didn't even talk about your bodily functions openly. So, I mean, when she said to me, do they teach you at school, I was very happy to say, yes, they do, I know all about it, and go on,
And that
as
didn't
opposed
worry
to
you?
her. Oh, no. But then, on the other hand, I mean, I grew up, I think, with a great innocence, I mean, a great fear. I don't think I really knew how exactly you got pregnant until I was about 18. I mean, I knew the fundamentals, but I don't think I really knew all the details. But I also remember, I went to Canada when I was 17 and stayed there for about a year. And my father knew that I'd met this boy that I really, really liked. And I used to love getting his letters, because he never, ever specified. He never said in the letter, no, I mean, don't sleep with this boy or anything like that, I mean, don't do anything. All he would ever say to me was, well, I know, dear, how relationships can get, really quite intense and very close, particularly when you're coming home. So just keep that very much under control.
Particularly while you're coming home?
Well, I was coming home from Canada,
Oh,
you
yes.
see. I mean, he knew that I was leaving in about a month's time. So it was his little way of saying, now don't get too strung up about this fellow because you're leaving Canada. Just play it nice and cool. But you see, we were really taught right and wrong. I mean, again, it was the black and white in those days, and you just did not sleep with fellows because it was wrong to do. It was, you know, simple as that.
You accepted it as easily as that?
I did. I mean, you know, I did it. Not that I didn't want to, but I just accepted it. It was wrong to do it. It was a sin to do it. And you see, I also was brought up with the whole Bible thumping routine, not from my parents, but I grew up during that era of the 50s, I'm talking about now, when the American evangelists were coming over to the north of Ireland. So we had the Billy Grahams and all his associates, and it was all fire and brimstone stuff, you know. I mean, I actually believed, when I was about 14, I believed, truthfully, that if you went to the pictures or went to a dance or did any of those sort of worldly things, what I would have thought worldly in those days, that you would go to hell. I really did. I believed that for a period of time.
And did you go to those meetings? You did?
All the time. You see, my Sunday was spent going to church. I went to church 5 times in a Sunday, partly because I think there was nothing else to do. I went to children's service in the morning. I went to main service after that. I went to Sunday school in the afternoon. I went to main service in the evening. And I even went to an organisation called the Christian Workers' Union after that again, which was like a kind of prayer meeting, come a cup of tea and a chat. But part of that was because there was really nothing to do on a Sunday. Everything was closed. And so if a group of us were going here, there, you know, it was sort of being with the crowd and doing things as opposed to staying at home.
Do you spend a lot of time looking back?
No, not an awful lot. I think it's only through interviews, really, that you're forced to look back. And I mean, I've never really analysed any of these feelings at all until I started to do more and more interviews when I came here.
Are you nostalgic?
No, not especially. I mean, I have very, very good memories, but I mean, it's not that I don't long to be back in those days or anything like that. I mean, yeah, they're very good to look back on. And if I had to live my whole life all over again, I wouldn't change any part of that childhood, not any part of it. In fact, I'd change very little of my life.
Have you inherited your mother's ability to bake that brown bread?
Have not. I'm the worst person under the sun. Well, I'm just not that way inclined. Well, when I was younger, and I would say to her, you know, show me how to do this. And even in recent years, because an awful lot of people here inquire about it, I'll say, show me how to do it. And she said, I couldn't. It's a handful of this and a handful of that. And she was just such a good cook that in a way I don't think she could be bothered with us around the kitchen. So I never learned to cook. Still trying to learn how to cook. So I didn't inherit any of those.
You've made me hungry talking about this. I almost can smell the bread. Thank you very much, Gloria Hunniford, for letting us look into your delightful background.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.